Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. Really glad to have you with us here. And wow, we've survived together the February 2019 bar exams. Hopefully you've survived it. I'm pretty sure we're still have all of our limbs intact here. And in today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about what was tested in some of the big exams around the country and some early feedback from students as they were leaving the test centers and test sites. So I hope you'll stick around for that. And I hope that if you took the exam, it was a good test for you. If this is your first time on the podcast, welcome. We're glad to have you with us. We come to you each week about this time to talk about all things related to the bar exam, and we're just delighted that you found us. We do these podcasts in a couple of different formats. You can watch the video every week by going to celebrationbarreview.com / and then enter the episode number. The episode for today is 240. So celebrationbarreview.com / 240, and you can watch the video and check out the show notes there. If you prefer to listen to your podcast, you can do that on Apple iTunes, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and lots of other places where podcasts are syndicated. And again, there are show notes attached there. And if you want to go back into our archives, we've been doing these podcasts now, well, this is episode 240, but we've been doing them for about 4 years. And you can check out the earlier episodes on our website. Just click on the podcast tab on the site. You can go back in to the very first episodes all the way through and check out the episodes and the show notes. So lots of different ways to get this information, but glad you found us. Thanks for referring this podcast to your friends and colleagues. We've grown so much over the past few years in terms of our audience. We know that's because folks keep telling others about it. So I very much appreciate that. Now, as I said, we're going to talk about the February 2019 exams, but I also know we've got a lot of you getting ready for the July 2019 or even now the February 2020 exams. And so I want to make you aware of a special training that we're offering every Thursday at 7 p.m. This training is titled Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. And in this 90-minute program, we're going to walk you through the 4 steps that bar takers have to follow in order to be successful. We use lots of case studies, lots of examples. We'll show you step-by-step the methodology that you need to follow. Now, this training is completely free, but you do need to register, and you can do that in one of a couple of different ways. You can go right here to the show notes on either the audio or video page, click on the button, register, Thursday night, 7 p.m., or you can go to celebrationbarreview.com / webinar and register there. Now, if Thursday at 7 p.m., your local time does not work for you, then you will also see an option for an instant replay, an on-demand replay from before, and you're welcome to get the material that way. So whatever works best for you, either on-demand replay or Thursday night, 7 p.m. We really hope you'll join us. This is life-changing information, and we know it can be incredibly helpful to you. It's completely free of charge, and really, I think if you've been frustrated or angry or disappointed about the bar, either because you've taken it before or you just heard about it and you're frightened of it, then make sure you check out this special webinar training. It's really a wonderful opportunity to take step-by-step what you have to do in order to be successful. So that's what's going on. Glad to have everybody with us. Wanted to sort of switch gears here and talk about the bar exams. We're going to look at specifically the Florida bar, California bar, the uniform bar exam, which includes New York and about 33 other jurisdictions, and the Georgia bar. Talk a little bit about the multi-state and give you some general feedback on what students had to say as they were coming out of the exams. So let's begin with a look at the Florida bar. So for those of you that are watching on video, you realize the background has just changed. For those of you listening, let me just explain. I'm using a virtual background here of a picture of the bar exam room. I thought it would just sort of give a warm, fuzzy feeling for those of you that took the exam. So, hey, that's why you ought to be watching on video, right? But I wanted to start by talking about the Florida bar exam, always near and dear to my heart. Oh, those wacky Florida bar examiners. What was going on this exam? Well, for those of you that are not familiar with the Florida exam, there are 3 essays an hour long in the morning, and then multiple choice topics. There are 3 separate topics combined together in multiple choice format in the afternoon. So here's what was tested in February 2019. The first essay was a trust question, and I had predicted in my infamous or famous preview videos to my students that I thought trust was a very high probability of being tested on the exam. It turned out that was correct. The trust question was relatively straightforward. It had to do with the validity of a trust, the claims made against a trust, and how the trust would be eventually distributed. And we have some questions about what the trustee is doing and the trustee's work, but then there's an attempt to revoke the trust, and then some claims about whether or not the revocation was effective or valid or not. So that was the first essay question. It was, I think, not an easy question. No one ever really jumps up and down and says, yippee, it's trusts, but it was relatively straightforward. The second essay in Florida was a little more challenging, I thought, in some respects. It was a 2-topic exam. It was secured transactions, which I also had predicted to be on the exam, and ethics, professional responsibility / professionalism. Now, I want to talk about this thing called professionalism because the examiners have apparently decided that they want to ask about something called professionalism. And they actually say in one of the calls of the questions, what professionalism issues does this letter from an attorney to an opposing party, what does it raise? Typically, we would have thought of these as Florida professional responsibility questions, but there's obviously something else going on here. We've seen this trend the last couple of exams. The examiners are now calling this professionalism. So we had focused a bit on this in our course. We had expected it. We told students to expect professionalism as a subgenre of professional responsibility, and sure enough, it showed up in question number 2. As for the UCC Article 9, secured transactions, this had to do with creating a valid security interest. And then there is a repossession, and whether or not that repossession is going to be legal or not. And this is a fairly typical kind of fact pattern. Has an interest been properly formed? If it has, and then the creditor attempts to repossess the item, is the repossession proper? And then some questions about collateral and the rights of a loan company and collateral other than foreclosure. And the question is, what other causes of action beyond foreclosure does a collateral holder have? So it's an interesting fact pattern, fairly long fact pattern, 5 calls of the question, including professionalism. So I imagine that this question was pretty challenging to most students. Secure transactions is probably not the most favored subject for most people. And, again, not a big subject, but one that I think is challenging. And when you add professionalism to it, I think it made it even more difficult. And then question number 3 in Florida, this was a torts question, a slip and fall question, which is a pretty basic tort kind of problem. But then after we get into the tort question, which asks about the claims and the defenses in a lawsuit against the supermarket, which is about as generic, I think, as you can get in a torts problem, we also get a lawyer making a fee proposal for a referral to the personal injury attorney. And so there we are back again in professional responsibility. Now this time they talk about ethical issues as compared to professionalism. So I think really what the distinction is that in this question, they're really asking about rules 4 and 5 of the Florida Rules of Professional Responsibility as compared to the subgenre of professionalism in question number 2. As for the tort problem, I think slip and fall is probably the kind of thing that you would expect. There's a question as to whether or not there's some contributory negligence here. And also, we've got the problem really of an eggshell plaintiff. So there's some interesting things going on in the problem. I had predicted torts as well. So what that meant is I called all 4 of the topics that showed up. Torts, UCC 9, trusts, and ethics. So there you go. My Nostradamus powers were well intact on that part of the exam. As for Florida multiple choice questions, as always, they were in procedure, civil and criminal procedure, and then evidence and wills were the other 2 topics that were tested, at least from what we've heard. Again, those were all topics I had predicted. So there you go, yay me. Now, results in Florida are coming out. They'll be released April 22nd. And, good luck to everybody there. I'll share some comments with students, from students, when we wrap up our discussion of all of the different jurisdictions. But that's what we know about Florida at this point. Was it a hard test? Yeah, absolutely. Was it an impossible test? No. And all things considered, not a lot of surprises on that exam. Well, continuing our move around the country to different bar exams, I've changed my background again, and now we're looking at the California bar exam, which of course has lots and lots of testing centers as compared to the one massive center in Florida. That doesn't mean it's any better or easier, it's just a little different look in all of the rooms. So in California, we have 5 essays and a performance test on the one day of the exam. This is, of course, a change from the last few years where we had a 3-day test. So the test is beginning to kind of get its rhythm and its feel. And again, I was really kind of amazed at how accurate I was. I say that like I should be surprised, but I was pretty accurate again with what I thought was going to be on the exam. So let's take a look at what was being tested. Now, in California, we don't have the actual essay questions in front of us yet. So we're really just dealing with the perception of students as they came out of the room and what they told us. So this is all subject to change, and that would be true really for everything. All right, so in the morning session in California, the first question was a wills essay with a crossover to community property. We don't know much about what was going on there. It didn't get a lot of reaction, but I do want to point out here, I thought wills was very likely to be tested. It had been tested the past 2 February's exams, and so I thought it was a good likelihood, and in fact, it did come up. But community property was interesting because, as I said to my students before the exam, community property is either going to be a not tested at all subject because it's been on every exam for a while, or it's going to be on every exam. It's going to become a new consistent like ethics or professional responsibility. Well, it was on this exam, and so I think we can now start to say with some degree of certainty that community property appears to be an every exam kind of topic. And it's not a difficult subject, to be sure. Take the assets and divide them up. That's not a big deal, but it is something that the examiners now have tested 3 exams in a row. That's a lot. And so we think that's a subject that bears some really close attention as you're studying. So that was wills and community property as essay number 1. Essay number 2, and it remains to be seen as we see the actual question and hear from more students, but it appears to me, based on what my students are saying, that question number 2 was all about torts, and it looks like it was a straight up torts question, although it did ask something about remedies. Now, let me be clear. There are remedies as a separate topic in California, and then there's tort questions and contracts questions. However, when you've got a torts question or a contract question, you often have to talk about the remedy in order to finish the analysis. As best I can tell, this was really a generic torts question, and then you had to discuss remedies as part of the overall answer, but it wasn't a pure, there's already been a tort committed, now discuss the remedies. So I think torts is primarily where that subject would have been, or how we would categorize it more than remedies. I did predict a torts essay and thought it was likely to be on the exam. So one subject only, torts, for essay number 2. Essay number 3 was in the area of real property, and this was on landlord and tenant problems. This is, again, a subject that I had anticipated to be on the exam. I had pointed out to my students that property is a subject that seemed ripe for another test. Landlord-tenant issues are certainly coming up more and more frequently in real property problems across the country, so no real surprise there. Now, as to the afternoon session, the 4th essay of the day was an evidence essay, and there was a question about subject matter jurisdiction. Now, again, I thought evidence was more likely to be tested than not. The question was whether or not we would be dealing with California evidence or multi-state evidence. It looks to me that it was generic. I didn't get a lot of sense about the evidence portion that it was specific to California rules of evidence. So I'm going to assume at this point, until we hear more, that it was sort of generic multi-state federal rules of evidence. In terms of the subject matter jurisdiction, this is a crossover. We've got some civil procedure. That's what we're dealing with. Whenever we're talking about subject matter jurisdiction, I would say that we're probably more in the realm of federal civil procedure than state civil procedure. So I am presuming that, again, this was a evidence and civil procedure both in the multi-state realm. That seems to be the feedback from our students as they were coming back in. But again, a crossover question, so that's going to make it challenging, a lot of calls of the question and a fairly challenging problem. All right, and then essay number 5. This one was no surprise at all. This was professional responsibility. I had said this was absolutely going to be on the exam, and it was. So no real surprise there. And this is a topic that I think you're going to see virtually on every exam. So maybe community property and ethics become 2 absolutes exam after exam. So again, nothing that really struck me in terms of subject matter as being all that surprising. Only 2 questions that were crossovers as far as I can tell. So not as lengthy kinds of problems as the examiners have done on some prior exams. Does that mean it was an easier test? I doubt it, but that's what we're working with. As far as the performance test went, this was a persuasive brief, so persuasive document to a legal audience. It was in criminal law and procedure. I heard a lot of good comments from my students that they thought it was really an enjoyable task to do. It was fair and challenging. Again, it was what we had predicted in terms of the form of the exam. I thought persuasive task to a legal audience was the most likely form of the performance test, and that's the way it worked out. Now, California results will be coming out on May 17th. So that's a long way. You can see from the April 22nd results in Florida to the May 17th results in California. It's a very long wait. And I had mentioned earlier that I think one of the problems with the California bar exam is that they take far too long in getting the results out and putting their repeat takers at a disadvantage. This is, I think, is a pretty good example. Florida bar taker who has to resit for the multi-state will actually have nearly April, May, a full month of extra study time over a California bar taker. So I think that's unfortunate that it works out that way. In general, again, we got some comments from California bar takers. I'll share those with you in just a few minutes. But I think that for the most part, people felt pretty good about the exam. There was nothing really terribly surprising, at least for our students, and that's always good. Well, the next jurisdiction that I want to take a brief look at is the uniform bar exam. This is the test that's given around the country, 33 plus jurisdictions right now, including New York, New Jersey, DC, lots of states. And it also is offered in some states that give just the multi-state essay exam, the MEE. The way that the UBE is structured is that there are 6 30-minute essays across a variety of 14 different topics, and then 2 90-minute performance tests. Now, again, I wasn't quite as good in my predictions, but not bad here across the UBE, so let's take a look at them. I don't have any particular order in which the questions were asked, but here's what I know. One of the essays was in criminal law. I thought that this was slightly above halfway to be tested, but it was not one of my predicted topics necessarily. But crim law was tested in February of 2018. So again, this year in February of 19. And we will be anxious to see what they did with it. In the past, there have been some insanity questions, fitness to stand trial, a little bit of constitutional criminal law around Miranda rights and so on. So I'll be anxious to see what this question looked like this time. The next essay that I've got is one I did predict, and this was in the area of torts. Torts had not been tested since 2017 on the UBE. I thought it would be this time. And across the country, we had a fair number of torts essays. So we certainly had one here on the UBE. Again, no crossover, just a straight torts question. The third essay topic that we saw in the UBE was federal civil procedure. Again, this was one of the topics that I had predicted as my 6. It was tested last in February 2018. So again, cycling around to February 2019. The other 3 essays that were tested, secure transactions. So you notice that's come up in a couple of jurisdictions now. That's interesting to me. We didn't see a lot of UCC 9 questions a few years ago. We're seeing more and more of them. The topic was last tested before this exam in July of 2017. I thought that made it a good likelihood in the UBE this time, and in fact it was. The next topic that was tested was trusts and future interest. Interesting how much correlation there was between Florida and the UBE, I thought, this year. That doesn't mean Florida's going to go to the UBE. It's just interesting that they seem to be tracking. This trust question The last time we had a trust question on the UBE was July of 2018. So we followed it up a second time. I thought that meant it was not likely to be tested. I was surprised by that, frankly, but there you go. It was on the exam. And then the sixth of the essays was the last one that I predicted, and that was agency and partnerships. I like it when agency and partnerships comes along. I think those questions are relatively straightforward. It was tested last in February of 2018, so a fairly frequent exam topic. It's come up in the February exam 3 years in a row, which is interesting. Typically, these are questions about dissolution, winding up, duties of partners, liability of new partners. So I'll be anxious to see what that question looks like again when it is released out into the world. So the 6 essays then that ultimately came up were crim law, torts, federal civil procedure, UCC 9, trust and future interests, and agency and partnerships. So I think a pretty wide-ranging test, an interesting test, and of those 6 topics, I accurately predicted 5 of them. So pretty good. Now, in terms of the performance tests, there are 2 performance tests. The first was a brief for a preliminary injunction. So this is persuasive to a legal audience. It was something about a woman that owned a daycare center and they were going to revoke her license. So that was the first performance test. The second performance test was an objective memo to a legal audience, had to do with negligence. There was a passenger that was in a car that was injured and they were asking for damages from injuries, and you were asked to write a memo apparently talking about their possibility of success and addressing the duty of the driver and the other duties in the problem. So this is a very typical pattern, a persuasive document and an objective document, both to legal audiences, both exactly what we predicted in terms of one of each of those 2 styles. So no surprises there at all. Now, in terms of when results come out in the UBE, well, obviously it depends on the jurisdiction. There will be some early UBE jurisdictions that release very early in April. Typically the jurisdictions that are larger, like New York and New Jersey, we would expect to see those results in early May. And I would say that's probably a good general benchmark. And we'll see results across UBE jurisdictions from early April until about mid-May, just before the California results come out. So be on the watch for those. We'll be talking about them as they come out in different jurisdictions. The other thing to keep in mind about the UBE, of course, is that you need a different score in order to pass, depending on your jurisdiction, from a low of 260 on up. So always interesting to see as those results come out. And people may have sat in a particular jurisdiction, not hit the number. For example, a 266 in New York is required, but they got a 261 or a 262. What's good enough to pass and get into 5 or 6 other jurisdictions. So lots of possibilities there. And again, not a lot of comments. I mean, our students were around the country in a variety of different testing centers and states, but not a lot of sense of being surprised by the UBE exam. The next jurisdiction we're going to look at is Georgia, and if that room looks familiar to you in Georgia bar takers, it's because that's the Georgia bar exam room behind me. Ooh, just kind of gives you the chills, doesn't it? Okay, so in Georgia, we have 4 essays and 2 performance tests. I've already told you about the performance tests, but those are the same ones that are given in the UBE, so again, no surprises there. The 4 essays, I did reasonably well, which is to say I didn't bomb it. There were a lot of crossovers, and I'm still trying to get a sense of what went with what, but here are the topics that were covered in the 4 essays. Like we had seen in some other jurisdictions, crim was tested on this exam. That was interesting to me. Typically in Georgia, they like to test criminal procedure, so that's my guess as to what was going on here. And then we also had wills and trusts on this exam. So that's trusts in a couple of different jurisdictions. That's interesting. In Florida and the UBE in Georgia, not typically what you would see, but it was on this exam as well. Another topic that was tested was domestic relations. I did predict domestic relations for this exam. It's been a fairly frequent subject over the years, but then dropped off for a while. We saw it last in February of 2018, and I had a spidey sense it might be on this exam, and apparently it was. The next topic was Georgia civil procedure. This had been tested twice in 2017, but not at all in 2018, so I thought it was likely on this exam, and in fact, it was. Now, the last time they tested procedure, they went really narrowly with an ante-litem problem. I'll be curious to see whether or not they went narrow or went more broadly to things like statutes of limitations or service of process or jurisdictional kinds of questions. But we'll see. But in any event, it was Georgia civil procedure, not federal. The other subject that was tested, not a surprise, I did predict it, was ethics. This was tested in February 2018 as a crossover. My guess is it was a crossover this time as well. So basically, I predicted 3 subjects that were on the exam. There were 2 that I did not predict, crim and wills trusts, but ethics and Georgia civil procedure and domestic relations all on the exam, as well as the performance tests in the way that we thought they might show up. Now, Georgia's a tough exam to figure out because they don't give us much information beforehand, nothing afterwards in terms of scoring. So we're kind of stuck trying to figure out what's going on there. It is a tough test. There are 19 testable subjects, so narrowing that down to 4 questions with a couple of crossovers, which is obviously what we've got, is certainly a lot to do, and it's a big task. The exam results in Georgia, we don't have a fixed date, but typically late May for the February test is when we would expect to see those results. These results could very well come out after the California results this year. And it's, again, one of the things I think is unfortunate, but that's the reality that we've got in Georgia. The other jurisdiction that we haven't talked about is Texas. And the reason we don't say much about Texas is because Texas already announces what they're going to test in terms of their subjects going in. We know that they're going to be 12 essay questions, each of them half hour in length. The only real question is oil and gas, 1 question or 0 questions in the property package. Then there's a package of questions with domestic relations and community property. The third set is wills and estates, pretty traditionally tested in that form. The fourth subject is the Uniform Commercial Code. One of the questions is Article 3.4, the other is Article 9. The next grouping is agency, partnership, and corporations. Sometimes you get a couple of corporations questions, but most often it's one of each of those, agency, partnership in one, corporations in the other. And then the final grouping is the Guardianship and Texas DTPA Act, having to do with consumer protection. So those are the groupings. There's not really any surprise. There's not much to predict there. And then there is one of the 2 performance tests given by the national conference, and of course there's the Texas procedure and evidence. So that's what goes on. Nothing particularly unusual there. We didn't hear much out of our Texas students. So we take that as no news being good news and no real surprises on that part of the exam. In terms of when Texas results come out, we would expect those results to be typically around the same time as New York releases. So I would say earlier in May is most likely, and we'll keep you updated on specific dates as we get them and as we get more detail. So that's the first cut. If I sound a little vague, it's because we're just hearing from students as they're coming out of the rooms. And so sometimes we get information that's really good and we can use it. Sometimes we don't get great information. And so that's what we know at this moment. Now, I want to just sort of segue for a minute to talk about some of the comments we did get from students, some general ideas and thoughts about the exam itself. And so I'm back in my office now to talk about some of the comments I heard from students. You know, it's always interesting to kind of hear from students just as they come out of the exam. What is their initial reaction and feeling, no matter where they are? One thing I will say is I got very little reaction to the multi-state itself. And that's always good, because what that tells me is that the multi-state wasn't surprising. Nothing threw people. They weren't sort of freaked out by any part of it. I think when the exam switched a little bit in terms of format, adding civil procedure, that obviously was a big deal a few years ago. Then when they went to 175 questions that counted, even though that didn't mean anything in the actual taking of the test, I think people were more on edge about it. It was actually pretty quiet. Most of our students felt pretty good about their multi-state performance. Now, in our course, most of our students finished the multi-state, each set of 100 questions, in 2.5 hours or less. So we did not have timing problems. If you had timing problems, I would suggest that you talk to us a little bit about the exam because it clearly didn't require a full 3 hours. So having said that, some comments that we got. One student said to us, your program, your emails were all really helpful. Your predictions were nearly spot on. The course support was really appreciated. This was from a student who said, I did the basic course, but I really appreciated the group coaching and the Facebook group. And that's always nice to hear when people are feeling good about that, no matter how challenging it is. And so that was good news. We heard from some California students that were very excited about the exam. They felt really positive and really pumped up. I think in part because it was not as bad a test as maybe they thought might happen. And they were staying focused and really locked in. Some really good sense of people saying things like it felt wonderful. I really was pleased. No surprises to me. I felt good about what happened. A student in California said, I gained a deeper understanding of the law and the American legal system. This was a foreign trained attorney. This individual indicates that they passed the MPRE exam with our help, and they said that I have no doubts with the understanding I gained from your program, my results will turn out well. Thanks for the help, and looking forward to successful results. We love it when people say things like that, for sure. We got some other interesting feedback in other places. Florida, of course, is always interesting. One student, an adult practicing attorney in another jurisdiction, said the biggest challenge in Florida for my aging, expanding body was being herded through the immensely long serpentine lines, through not enough checkpoints, and then waiting and waiting in a sardine-like compressed space for them to open the exam room doors and let us in. Us as in, several thousand bar takers, and how frightening, not frightening, but how challenging that was, and how frustrating that process was. And I think that's true definitely every year in Florida, but also some other big exam jurisdiction sites like New York and California. A lot of comments about how accurate I was, my prescience on predicting topics in Florida and California in the UBE. That's always good when people feel good about that. And then I got a really interesting comment. I wanted to share it with you, read a bit of the email that I got, because I think it's pretty interesting in terms of the overall take on the exam. The student wrote the day after the exam, I want to thank you for your insight. I'm not sure of my results, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, but not in the way that I initially planned. Like many of your students, this person wrote, the bar exam is the only thing I've ever failed. And as much as I hated math, I passed that exam to become an educator to students with exceptionalities. But the bar exam has been a beast. I even returned to school to get a PhD. It was tough, but I did that too. And yet it's the bar exam that's caused me to lose the most sleep. I hate leaving things incomplete. In the past, I took a big box bar review course, which left me confused and unsure of my path. I studied and memorized law after law after law, but it wasn't enough. I finally began to understand why I heard people say, quote, even if you know the law, you might still not pass the bar, close quote. And it made no sense to me at the time. However, it wasn't until I took your course that I began to realize why that comment made sense. It's a little like trying to install carpet without having all of the right tools. You know what you're doing, but you can't figure out why the carpet doesn't quite fit. I'm going to have to take that student's word for it. I've never tried to install carpet. Anyway, they said all the measurements are correct. The carpet rolled in perfectly, but something's missing that prevents a perfect installation. And until you figure it out, you're just stuck. That's how I felt about the bar until I took your course. On Tuesday, prior to testing, the student writes, I sat in my car and wept. It wasn't because I feared failure this time. No, instead it was because I found a new peace. Now I know that I have all of the tools to pass the bar. I'm extremely grateful and blessed to have made the right decision in choosing your course. You know, I really appreciate those kinds of comments, obviously, for lots of reasons. But one of the main reasons is because I know that really what the bar exam is about for so many people is something much bigger than just taking a test. And I really think that when you get around that and you realize what you're capable of doing and what can happen, it's pretty remarkable. And I'm glad to see good things happening. I'm glad people felt comfortable. That was representative of a lot of emails and text messages that I saw, a lot of posts on our Facebook group where students really talked about sort of not only their relief in having the test done, but their sense that they'd really conquered something. and something bigger than the bar exam. So I just wanted to leave you with that. I think it's a good place to end this first quick discussion of results, what we know, what's coming in. I know many of you were in those exams and you have probably your own sense of what was going on. I want to also remind you that we've done an episode previously on the podcast about whether or not you should post-mortem or sort of deconstruct or debrief your exams. It's episode 156, and we'll link to it in the show notes. I encourage you to check out that video if you haven't seen it previously. It's a good one about the value of talking it through and when you want to do it and when it's a good time to let go of it. For those of you that took the February 2019 exam, now you've got a few weeks of waiting. We'll be talking about that as we get closer in and as we go through this process and time of waiting. And then, of course, as we begin to see results in early April, and the first big state that releases will be Florida, April 22nd, we will come back with lots more information about these exams and the results and the test scores. At this point, that's pretty much what we know. If we see anything or hear anything that we think is significant, of course, we'll update you in the podcast. I want to thank all of you for being with us today. I know that probably when we talk about the jurisdictions that aren't yours, you're like, yeah, who cares? But I think it's important to get a sense of what's going on generally in the exams and the trends. And I think the good news is that there were no real massive surprises anywhere. There were also no big meltdowns in technology. I know that there were individual students that had challenges with their Examplify software, but we didn't have the big crisis that we've had in some of these other exams. So that was good news. I think in general, we can all sort of exhale, take a breath, turn our attention now to the July 2019 exams for preparation, and certainly to the results season as that begins in April. So thanks for everybody for being with us today. I want to just give you one last reminder. Thursday, 7 p.m., our webinar training, Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam your last bar exam. Make sure you register in advance. You can do that on the show notes or by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. It's been great to be with you. For those who took the exam in February 2019, congratulations. Go rest, have a life, enjoy yourselves for a few weeks, and we'll be back to talk to you when you get back in, ready to talk about results. For everybody else, I hope you'll join us again next week. We'll have more content for you, more information as we begin to gear up for the July exams. So take care, everybody. We'll see you soon along the Extra Mile.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.